Stay tuned. How does trust impede the effective return to economic health?
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the Voice for Ethics in International Affairs, in cooperation with Booz & Company Strategy and Business, MERT, and NYU's Center for Global Affairs. For more information, see www.carnegiecouncil.org.
What explains the growing lack of trust in the financial system, and how does it threaten the global economy? What are the ethical consequences and the ways to restore trust? We hope you enjoy the program.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Devin Stewart from Carnegie Council. Thank you for coming today. It's a beautiful spring day. Spring is a new beginning, and our panel on restoring trust in the global financial system will be an action-oriented panel, and we will make some progress toward restoring trust both in our financial institutions and Wall Street's trust in us and the world. So, Stephen Jordan, I will turn it over to you, and then we will do a panel discussion and open up for Q&A. Thank you very much.
It really is an honor for me to be here this afternoon with you all. The concept, the topic at hand is very troublesome, very problematic. I had this halfway decent set of remarks that I prepared for a while now, and I'm sitting there last night thinking about them, and I said, you know what? There's some fundamental ambiguities here that we're going to have to tease out. So I'm going to ad-lib a little bit, unfortunately. But what I have are actually more questions than answers. There's a fundamental ambiguity in the question, restoring trust in the financial system. Who should be restoring that trust? To whom? On this. And what I think is embedded in the predicate here is that there is no silver bullet, that there is no single shot that is going to solve all of the issues that we've got. We're in a sense, we're all kind of like the blind people around the elephant. And so some people are looking at, say, the credibility of financial analysts. Other people are looking at the regulatory environment for hedge funds. Other people are looking at financial literacy for consumers. Other people are looking at who should be lent to who and in what circumstances and how. So there's a certain impatience in our public dialogue right now that is very jarring when you consider that these problems didn't surface overnight, and it wasn't just one thing that caused them. And yet somehow we expect within 2 or 3 months or 6 months of the announcement of a stimulus package or something like that, poof, it's over or something. Trust, unfortunately, is one of those issues that it can take a lifetime to build up, and in a moment it's gone, and then you have to start over again on a very long-term process. And I will turn it over to Professor Donaldson. Thank you very much.
We have 3 very distinguished panelists today, and they will be talking not only about solutions but causes, because surely to find solutions we have to understand causes. In my own mind, there are at least 3 causes for the current economic crisis. One, a pattern of paying for peril, that is a pattern of rewards, especially in financial services industry, that didn't always align with the best interest either of the firm or of society. Something I refer to as the normalization of danger. It's a reflection of a psychological phenomenon fairly well studied, where in a group, in an industry, often essentially dangerous activities can be normalized to the point where people don't notice how dangerous they are. I'm reminded of Chuck Prince's famous remark, often quoted, when the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance. And certainly it was very difficult for any of the participants in financial services to say no to some of the activities that we now know were deadly in the long run. And the final item is what I refer to as tech shock. It's the shock that comes as we introduce new innovative techniques or technologies before we have our ethical, political, and social arms around them. We see this often in medicine, of course. The in vitro fertilization or cloning raises issues that we have difficulty handling. And it takes us a while to get our arms around them. And in the same way in business, whether it's off-book entities, which help bring down Enron, whether it's collateralized debt obligations or a market of credit default swaps, some of the other very complex financial technology that is a part of the current crisis, we have yet to get our arms around that. I'd be remiss, however, in not mentioning a possible fourth, and that is people like me, academics, do business schools, do economists who created some of the models that were used, bear and sent many of the people to Wall Street that engage in some of these activities, share some responsibility in this. I'm inclined to think no one is completely removed from responsibility. At any rate, the old line goes, you don't, with a person who's wrecked a school bus, buy them a new bus. And so one question is, do you hand back to the same institutions, government, industries as they stand, even academe, the tools with which to try to find a solution? Christian?
Let me start by maybe picking up from some remarks that Stefan made about the trust on what every day, for example, we consume. So some days ago, I got a phone call from consumer associations, and they were telling me that I shouldn't consume a certain product that I recently bought at the supermarket because there were some anomalies with it. And the same day, I got a phone call from a financial advisor that was telling me that I should invest in a fund because there was some subprime paper in it, or even prime paper in it. The second phone call never happened. That's not true. So that tells us a little bit about what are the mechanisms that lead us to trust a system, whether it's a financial system, real economies, or just what leads us to the common behavioral patterns in everyday life, when we consume a meal, when we ride a bus, and so on and so forth.
I'd like next to introduce Neil Flieger.
Thank you. The reason I'm here, I think, is that Edelman has, over the past 9 or 10 years, commissioned a study through our research company that tracks trust in institutions. We've done it since 2001, and we have measured trust in business, in government, in the NGO community, and in media. And for the past 9 years, the survey has always been quite interesting in informing us about what kind of latitude clients have to move forward, or speaking as the chairman of Global Public Affairs, where government is with respect to what business wants to do. This year, not surprisingly, the data was more interesting and more compelling and a little bit more stark than it has been ever before. We've seen some interesting things in this year's data. Every year that we've done this in the past, if you look at the two main institutions that we tested. We test this, by the way, with about 4,500 or 5,000 people in 20 countries around the world. The survey this year was fielded between the second week in November and the first week in December. Our sample are the people in this room. They are highly educated. They are the top 10% of income in each country. They are heavy consumers of information, so they read 5 or 6 different sources of information on a weekly basis. So that's who we sampled. Every year that we've done this in years past, when there has been a rise or a fall in trust among those groups in either the institution of business or government, it is offset by the other side. So the trust relationship between business and government for the past 9 years, and in those 9 years you saw 9/11, you saw Enron, we saw the war start and the hostilities against the war. So we've seen some fairly great fluctuations, but it has always been a zero-sum game. In the past 2 years, the preceding 2 years, trust in government, not only in the United States but around the world, was at an all-time low. In what we consider to be sort of the structural basement, which is about the mid-30%. Numbers of respondents were saying they trusted government to do the right thing. That was offset by the fact that trust in business was at about, globally at about 52. In the United States it was close to 60%. The drop was almost 30% this year. So what you, there was a similar drop, not as high, but to the structural basement in government. So for the first time this year, you see among this respondent group a complete or structural lack of trust in business to do the right thing, and a lack of trust in government. And the notion that that they're not offsetting one another for us was particularly compelling. I'm going to highlight a couple of more findings and then talk about some implications. The second thing that is interesting here is we asked respondents, given what's happened, given this lack of trust that you have, who do you view as being responsible for addressing the problems of the financial crisis or other large societal global problems, global warming, energy, things like that? First, we asked them who was responsible for causing it, what's very interesting is that business and government are equally seen as responsible for causing all of these problems. And who's responsible for solving is, although there's some more fluctuation, although they don't, this is what's interesting, although the respondents don't trust or lack trust for both business and government, when they ask them what should be done about this, they want business and government to lead in defining what those solutions are.
Thank you, Neil. James?
Trust is a slippery concept, but I think of it as the expectation that you hold that something will work out the way you anticipated it would. That simply, whether it's buying milk or a financial contract. And it only takes one bad jug of milk to make you think 4 or 5 or 6 times about whether it'll be okay the next time. And I think it's pretty asymmetric, and that's we're in a world of hurt on that. So the first point I'll come back to is I think we have a social and political problem as well as a business problem. The second point, I'll expand on each of these, is that notwithstanding, I think it's pretty important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There was a period during the early Industrial Revolution in England where a group of people known as the Luddites went around actually breaking the machines that they perceived to have stolen their opportunities for deploying their own labor. And I think we have to be careful not to do that, no matter how upset we are. Third point is, this is a global problem. We've really been talking more or less domestically about it. I got back from the UK last night, and they're fixated on pensions and teacher salaries and the like, as well they should be. We're really worried about unemployment. We're worried about small investors. We're worried about borrowers, and as well we should be. But we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world where all these flows move about incredibly quickly, and I don't think we've fully addressed that. And it feels to me overall this is a bit like the global environment. It wasn't until, I suspect, Chinese pollution hit Newport Beach that people in certain echelons in America finally took it seriously, that we had to have a global solution to a global problem, even if we didn't like the allocation of the cost. So the problem, of course, is that we don't have an easy way to coordinate what's needed globally. I think, first of all, we have institutions like Citi, like HSBC, like UBS, that are in 60, 70, 80 countries, and there's almost no coordination of how to manage them. I think we need a home regulator, and then we need a team of regulators to manage their global activities from the major markets we're in. We've got to have the same regulation for derivatives and other instruments across countries. For example, if we put in a clearinghouse for derivatives in the U.S. and they don't put one in the U.K., where do you think the derivatives business will go? I mean, it's like water. It's just going to go downhill to the jurisdiction with the least control. Accounting approaches have to be the same. I mean, not to a minuscule level, but very largely, or we'll find people moving their activities and their bean counting to where the treatment will be most favorable. Finally, turning to the domestic front, I mean, 4 major shortcomings as I see it. We have not had competent regulation. So we had this rush to innovate, but actually the regulators were outgunned, often not as sophisticated. They weren't paid enough. There weren't enough of them. They were absolutely understaffed and sometimes intimidated by the people that they regulated. I think we have to fix those issues. I think second, I agree with the suggestion that if you take a large institution that's systemically important, a hedge fund, insurer, a bank, I don't care, we have to limit the amount of leverage that they have, because their costs when they blow up are not just restricted to their investors or debt holders or shareholders. We all pick it up. So it's like having big buses on the road and we don't know how the brakes are going to. We're all on the road with these folks. I think third, the incentives for senior managers, key traders, people who get to make major bets in institutions have to be symmetric, or as close as we can get within the confines of law. In other words, we need to take money from their bonus and hold it aside. There need to be clawback provisions. We may need extended liability beyond simply what they've earned from that institution, because otherwise you're going to take a bet with other people's money and you're going to go further with it than you ever would with your own. That's just human nature.
So we have a serious problem, gentlemen, and Seamus has already talked a little bit about some of the changes, mostly, interestingly enough, regulatory. What does the banking industry itself, and I want to include hedge funds here, what does the banking industry need to do, if anything? And to take two controversial topics that Seamus may or may not want to comment on, should there be more transparency around these toxic assets? And should we imitate, as our European friends are doing, government regulations for bonuses and compensation arrangements?
I recently saw some research that looked at issues of not just banker, but senior executive CEO compensation in the wake of the financial crisis and what people think, and looking at compensation as being one of the factors that drives distrust, personal, individual distrust. And several different samples asked several different ideas about what should be done and what would cause people to again feel better about these executives. The same idea scored both off the charts up and off the charts down. If you say, do you think that the CEO of a publicly held company that is experiencing whatever, define it however you want to define it, hard time, should cut their salaries excessively, take $1, insert particularization here, but take $1 a year, forswear bonuses, cut their salaries by 95%, whatever. Above 90% of people think that is a really strong thing to do. In another sample, we asked basically the same question, but we said, should the government require, and fill that in, and fewer than 15% of people thought that was a good idea. So I think that what that says, this was U.S. research, this wasn't international research, but I think what that says, at least about the United States, is that they don't, I don't think people really want to see structural legal limits other than punitive on on the opportunity that could exist for somebody who is capable of doing well.
My question would go then to the mention by Mr. Jordan about embedding a culture of restraint and the humility to know that the long term, to take advantage of or to be mindful of the long term. And then also what you talked about with the Wealth of Nations and the comment about harnessing human self-interest for the common good. And how do we do that embedding? Where do we begin?
This crisis clearly has shown that the battle for self-regulation is lost, right? Especially if we think about the bubble on the alternative investment side. And if we think that large institutions that are systemically important and can actually cause harm to the whole system, not only domestic but global. That calls for more oversight and regulation, limits on leverage, attention on this pro-cyclicality of leverage that has brought us to this large credit boom that has turned into a bust and that we are all going to pay for at the end of the day. So I think that regulation doesn't have to be seen necessarily or restraining this laissez-faire type of economy. Doesn't necessarily to be something that suffocates the system. It can be something that reduces the volatility of returns. But reducing the volatility of returns means that perhaps we're going to make a little less money during booms, but we're going to also lose less during busts. I mean, let's think about this.
This whole subject of restraint, I heard recently the conservative Prime Minister of Canada who said that government regulation has worked very well in Canada, and the banks there are not allowed, or they either not allowed or they choose not to sell mortgages. They hold them to their own portfolio. And so my question to the panel is maybe we should look at Canada to see how we regulate our financial institutions. And I just want to add one other thing. There is a strong entrepreneurial element in Canada. It's called blackberries. So they have a vibrant entrepreneurial economy, and they have restraint among their financial institutions.
We were talking about this over lunch, and actually in between stints as a consultant, I've been a banker regulated by OSFI in Canada, OCC and the OTS here, and by the FSA in the UK, and have friends in many other countries. I think, personally, the Canadian regulators have been the most consistently sophisticated and thoughtful, which is interesting because the country is, a tenth the size. And I'm not sure all the reasons for that, but it's a very prestigious and reasonably apolitical career. I mean, it's a technocratic, but also politically pragmatic career, and you can go a long way. I mentioned this in one of my remarks. I think that we have, and maybe this is a part of the culture of restraint where we can do something reasonably quickly. We've demeaned and diminished the role of banking and financial regulators, the SEC, the OCC, and so forth, in this country in the last 10 years in a way that I think was bound to end in tears. I don't think it's as simple as saying a single regulator will fix everything, because the UK has had a single regulator, and they were, if anything, even cozier, with the problem children than ours were. But I agree with you. I think we can look to Canada and ask some fairly deep questions about why that's working.
Regarding the changes in consumption patterns, for example, in the United States, and then I'll touch a little bit on Europe as well. Clearly that's happening, and that's not just a domestic phenomenon, but that's going to translate itself into a global phenomenon, right? We are a deficit country. I'm referring to current account deficits, and that's the mirror of surpluses of surplus countries like China, which have been the drivers of global growth in the last few years. So this change in consumption pattern is going to come, and it's going to be brought about by this sharp recession, by the fact that not only Americans, but in other surplus countries, people came to terms with the fact that there is a budget constraint, and that credit cards are not going to break this budget constraint ever. So there's going to be a change in consumption pattern. We are seeing it already. Savings rate went from negative to already close to 5%, and they're going to increase further. This is going to bring a rebalancing within the global economy. It's not going to close the surpluses that China and India have, and it's not going to close the current account deficit that the likes of the United States have. These countries, let's remember, they still need the consumer of last resort, which is the United States, to start their recovery, being export-led economies where 40% of their aggregate demand comes from export. And I'm thinking about China. So, regarding Europe, this attitude of not being willing to sort of take on one's shoulders mistakes of others, it's a global crisis. Right? It's not just a domestic crisis. It's a global recession. Europe is very much exposed to U.S. paper, and Europe is very much exposed to Eastern European paper. Eastern European papers that has nothing to do with U.S. paper, but has to do with erosion of lending standards that was taking place in those countries as well in the years in which they were playing catch up, hoping that one day they would end up under the umbrella of the monetary union. So I think that Europe should think a little bit more wisely about the effects of demise in the Eastern European economies, because many of their banks. Think Austria. 70% of the loans that have been originated in Austria and extended to Eastern European countries amount to 70% of the GDP of that country. So we can imagine how increased default rates can be very harmful for that country. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that Europe has to come out with a large fiscal stimulus where the Germans that are in better shape are going to save the Italians, the Greeks, the Portuguese, the Spain, the Club Med countries. But Europe has also to come to terms with the fact that they decided to navigate towards a common market, a common currency, and that at this point in time, the weakest link of the chain is the country that sets the value and the trust in that common currency.
Join me, won't you, in thanking our panel, our distinguished panel here.
We hope this program has been informative and has provided some perspective on the underlying ethical issues.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the Voice for Ethics in International Affairs, in cooperation with Booz & Company Strategy and Business, MERT, and NYU's Center for Global Affairs. For more information, see www